Welcome to the 2021 Symons Medal Presentation and Lecture on the State of Canadian Confederation, proudly presented annually at Confederation Centre of the Arts. Awarded to Canadians who have made outstanding contributions to our country. Previous recipients include the Right Honourable Beverly McLaughlin, Dr. David Suzuki, Professor Margaret McMillan, the Honourable Murray Sinclair, and the Honourable Bob Ray. A total of 21 recipients have been granted the award, hailing from coast to coast to coast. The Symons ceremony is held in the birthplace of Confederation to mark the anniversary of the Charlottetown Conference of 1864. Long before that historic meeting, Prince Edward Island was known as Abequit to the Mi'kmaq who have lived here since time immemorial. We proudly move forward together in the spirit of reconciliation and to continue the ongoing conversation of an evolving Canada. Since 2004, the Symons Lecture Series has provided a national platform for diverse and distinguished Canadians to share their thoughts on the current state of Confederation, giving all Canadians the opportunity to reflect upon our country and its future. Named in honor of the late Professor Thomas Symons, a visionary and founding president of Trent University, Professor Symons was widely recognized for his contributions in the areas of public policy, heritage, and education. Professor Symons has had a special relationship with Prince Edward Island for his entire life, visiting every summer since he was a teenager. He joined the board of directors of Confederation Centre of the Arts in 1986 and championed heritage programming at the centre for decades. Tom Symons passed away in January of 2021, and he is missed by all who knew him.
He was very humble.
He was a great guy, to say the least.
He was a very effective communicator.
When Tom spoke about something as passionately as he did, people sat up and took notice.
Tom was a builder of tradition, and you never realized you were in the center of tradition building until it happened.
Tom was always extremely engaged, an extremely active board member, contributing a lot, genuinely interested in all the conversations. And something I noticed is how inclusive and kind he was to newcomers. He really embraced them and engaged them, always sharing stories about the history of certainly the Symons Medal, but more broadly the history of this place and its role in celebrating Canada.
He was a dear, sweet man. A true historian, really. Takes one to know one.
We lost a great friend. We really lost a great friend.
The country and the world has lost an individual who really strived to foster understanding.
We have a unique opportunity here at the Centre to ensure the legacy of Tom lives on.
We'll certainly continue the Symons Medal in Tom's honor, and we're excited to establish an interpretive centre on Canadian heritage. We're going to find a permanent way to tell the many stories of Canada's history from the colonial and Indigenous perspectives, and really respect that tradition of what this place is here for, what it's here to celebrate. So we have a lot to give thanks for Tom.
Since Canada's Confederation, this nation has continued to evolve with a desire to become a better country. Sharing her unique and international perspective on the evolution of Canadian society is this year's Symons Medal recipient, the Honourable Louise Arbour.
As we gather this evening to award the Symons Medal to the Honourable Louise Arbour, the title of Madame Arbour's lecture, Deserunt Meliorem Patrium, or They Desire a Better Country, which is the motto of the Order of Canada. It will focus on the transformation of Canadian society through immigration, the pandemic, and the law. I will now ask Her Honour Antoinette Perry, Lieutenant Governor of Prince Edward Island, to join me for the introduction of the 2021 Symons Medalist.
Merci, Monsieur Cyr. Je suis enchantée d'être ici pour présenter l'honorable Louise Arbour, l'une des expertes en droit national et international du Canada les plus respectées et les plus en demande. Maître Arbour a été nommé juge à la Cour suprême de l'Ontario en 1987, puis juge à la Cour d'appel de l'Ontario en 1990. En 1996, le Conseil de sécurité des Nations unies l'a nommé procureur en chef des tribunaux pénaux internationaux pour l'ex-Yougoslavie et le Rwanda. À ce titre, elle obtient la première condamnation pour génocide depuis la Convention de 1948 sur le génocide dans le cas du Rwanda et la première mise en accusation de tous les temps d'un chef d'État européen en fonction pour crimes de guerre.
After serving at the UN as Chief Prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals, Madame Arbour was appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada in 1999. In 2004, she was appointed High Commissioner for Human Rights to the United Nations, and later Special Representative of the Secretary General on International Migration. Madame Arbour is a Senior Counsel at Gordon Ladner Gervais, LLP, and currently leading an independent review into the sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Ce ne sont là que quelques-uns des hauts faits d'une vie entièrement consacrée à la justice et aux droits de la personne. Tout au long de sa carrière, Maître Arbour a été reconnu pour ses contributions exceptionnelles au Canada et dans le monde. Elle est titulaire de plus de 30 diplômes honorifiques, membre de l'Ordre du Canada et lauréate du prix de la justice internationale et des droits de la personne Thomas J. Dodd.
And now, Confederation Center of the Arts is proud to present the 2021 Symons Medal to the Honourable Louise Arbour.
Dear friends, all protocol observed. I've learned that expression from the Secretary General of the United Nations, who is always very keen not to spend half his speech acknowledging all the excellencies in the room, and I think deep down is petrified that he might forget one, which could put a dent in his career. So he used that formula, all protocol observed, which... After all these amazing tributes, I feel I should maybe just take this little speech and go home, because I'm afraid there's no way I could live up to the expectations that these liars may have created. On the other hand, I'm quite happy that my granddaughter is here today, will be able to take home to her brothers the fact that Grand-Maman is really impressive. I'm very grateful to the board members of the Confederation Center for allowing me to join the list of these eminent Canadians who've been honored in the past 20 years as recipients of the Symons Medal. They represent a wide spectrum of this, at times, very puzzling country. Contrary to many of them, I didn't know Tom Symons personally, but I really hope that I'll be able to do justice to his memory tonight by trying to project into the future his vision for a country to which he gave so much. I have entitled my remarks today, Desiderantes Meliorem Patriam. I did a lot of Latin when I was in school. They desire a better country. And I'll explain later a little bit why I chose this title. But suffice it to say that Tom Symons very much desired a better country and inspired the many who have walked in his footsteps. When I was working as a judge, I was always conscious of the fact that our take on things starts always from a point of view, and no one can claim to have the universal one. Of course, like many of my colleagues on the bench, I've learned to strive to develop an objective and impartial point of view, which I think is a critical endeavor for a judge, but I don't operate under such constraints tonight. So I simply want to stress that the reflections that I propose to share with you are intensely personal. I feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to work on a great variety of issues in lots of different environments. I have no other ambition today than to share with you a few ideas that are rooted in my life and work through times of change and the promise of even greater change to come. Not surprisingly, it's in my international work that the issue of perspective and point of view has been the most glaringly apparent. Just as an example, in 2010, I was the recipient of what is called the North-South Prize of the Council of Europe. This prize is awarded, I think, every second year, usually to a man and a woman, one from the North and one from the South. And I shared the prize that year with President Lula da Silva of Brazil. Needless to say, he represented the South, I the North. Now, this geographic view of the world is, of course, the reverse image of the view from within Canada. There was something weird in my, quote, representing the North. In my Canadian eyes, I'm not from the North, and the North is not viewed as the wealthy one. In the same way, when I started teaching law at Osgoode Hall Law School in the mid-1970s, my English was far from fluent, and my thinking was still mostly in French. So when I was teaching criminal procedure, in English, of course, some of the women in my class thought that I was a master of the use of feminist political language. Because when I referred to the police, I always said she. And the same for the Crown. And the same for the defense, the court. I used she every time, evoking, they thought, a female office holder. Now, of course, in French, these words are all feminine. La police, la défense, la couronne, la cour. Actually, only the accused was always he. Since, as it happens, most of the time, he is, but also in French, it's masculine. This brings me to my first reflection about our country, a very personal one, as I said. I was born in Montreal. I was raised by my mother, who had to wait until 1968 to obtain a divorce, since before then, you had to get a private act of parliament to do so. A little over the top, if you ask me. I was in boarding school for several years, and I obtained my BA in that homogeneous Catholic girls' college operated by nuns. My view of the world was therefore informed by strong, capable, independent, educated women in an environment in which men were almost totally absent. Law school in 1967 felt at that time quite a liberating experience, a long overdue exposure to the larger world. It was the year of Expo, where I managed to land a job by pretending to speak English. Not a job on the site of the World Exhibition with direct exposure to the public, since without then the protection of anti-discrimination law, it seems that I didn't meet the height requirements to be a hostess in the Canadian Pavilion. I worked as a telephone operator. The whole world had come to visit. We had a brand new subway, which made hitchhiking less necessary in town, but still quite handy on the side of the highway to get around the Gaspé Peninsula. Another era altogether. Moving to English Canada in the early 70s, first to clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada for Justice Pigeon, and then to start teaching at Osgoode Hall Law School a few years later, was, in retrospect, without doubt, the biggest cultural shock I've ever experienced. When I went to work for the United Nations some years later, I expected to have to make some cultural adjustments. Needless to say, work in international human rights, particularly the field work, brought me to very exotic foreign places where I shared neither the language nor much else, really, with most of the people with whom I interacted. So why was it that Canada, my country, could have felt so alien when I first moved out of my zone of comfort? And why did the feeling take so long to dissipate, even though I lived and worked in Toronto for more than 25 years, and to this day I continue to work as much in English as in French? And isn't it part of the way we all feel as we are confronted, late, but increasingly so, with our pre-Confederation history and our shameful interface with those who were there before us? And who is us, anyway? Tout ceci m'amène à réfléchir aux notions d'identité et d'appartenance qui m'ont toujours intéressé et qui sont essentielles au projet canadien. Bien que la question soit d'une douloureuse actualité, je ne vais pas revenir aujourd'hui sur les questions qui touchent aux peuples autochtones, questions qui ont fait l'objet de la remarquable conférence prononcée ici même par l'honorable sénateur Murray Sinclair en 2019. Mes travaux en ex-Yougoslavie et au Rwanda, au lendemain des guerres fratricides qui les ont déchirés, m'ont confronté aux pires pathologies de l'appartenance et ont alimenté ma réflexion sur la gestion de la diversité aux prises avec son bagage historique, géographique et politique. Je vais donc vous inviter à réfléchir avec moi sur l'avenir de notre pays, un pays dans lequel l'histoire et la géographie sont parfois en compétition. Vu par le reste du monde, le Canada est souvent défini par sa géographie, beaucoup moins par son histoire. Une vaste étendue froide, peuplée par des espèces d'Américains du Nord. Et si ce grossier stéréotype vous semble exagéré, on n'a qu'à se référer à l'image qu'on a nous-mêmes des pays qu'on n'a jamais visités, que ce soit la Chine, la Russie ou la Bolivie, pour comprendre que les stéréotypes sont parfois inévitables. Vue de l'intérieur, la géographie joue encore une place que certains diront disproportionnée dans l'organisation de la gouvernance au Canada. Par exemple, au-delà des exigences constitutionnelles, l'attribution des 9 sièges à la Cour suprême du Canada, vous vous souviendrez, il y en a 3 qui sont requis pour le Québec, 3 qui sont traditionnellement attribués à l'Ontario, 2 aux provinces de l'Ouest et 1 siège aux provinces des Maritimes. Cet arrangement relève à la fois de l'histoire et de la géographie. Mais les contraintes imposées par cette répartition sont de plus en plus souvent confrontées aux attentes d'un Canada moderne, dans lequel ces deux notions, géographie, histoire, laissent beaucoup moins de place à d'autres considérations. L'attention accrue dans les dernières années à la nécessité d'une vraie diversité dans la composition de la Cour témoigne d'une évolution de la conception même que l'on se fait du Canada, une conception de plus en plus centrée sur les personnes et sur les cultures. This evolution was facilitated by the advent of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. Previous constitutional debates had centered, of course, on federalism and the distribution of powers under the British North America Act, which actually reminds me of an old joke about international students. Some of you may have heard that one at the time. These international students were asked to write an essay about love. So the French student wrote a thesis that was all about the perfect French lover. An American kid wrote about love and happy endings in Hollywood movies. A bunch of Scandinavian students wrote about love and the sexual revolution in the 60s. But the Canadian student was stuck, having a lot of trouble starting on his thesis entitled Love, Whether Federal or Provincial Jurisdiction. Not that we have abandoned altogether our addiction to debating the structures of our federal system, but the Charter, I think, has shifted the conversation to people, to individual rights, and universal standards. This brings me to who we are today, as a people living in a constitutional democracy, affected historically by the challenges of managing our differences, and I believe increasingly so in the future by the transformative effect of immigration, now anchored in a culture of rights. The wave of anti-foreigners, particularly anti-Muslim sentiments that submerged most of the Western world after the attacks on the World Trade Center some 20 years ago, followed by the more recent so-called migration crisis on the doorsteps of Europe, the Brexit movement, the rise of extreme right rhetoric, and the apparent increased attraction of authoritarianism, all of these have contributed to a negative portrayal of immigration that I believe must be and can be overtaken by a different, much more positive approach, at least in this country. This is not based on the periodic outpour of generosity that expresses itself in the face of unbelievable hardship, triggered, I think, for instance, this time, by the sentiment that we have abandoned the people of Afghanistan. I think when we look at newcomers, wherever they're coming from, we are conscious that we are looking into the future. For one thing, the absolute necessity of turning to migratory input to offset our demographic deficits will become increasingly apparent as labor shortages continue to plague our economy. At the same time, the so-called pushes and pulls that compel people to migrate will continue to increase, particularly in the face of the growing combined effects of climate change and income inequalities. I feel very privileged to have had an opportunity to work with the UN Secretary General on the Global Compact for Migration, which was adopted by UN member states at the end of 2018. It was for me an eye-opener into an issue that is at the heart of the future of this country, as much as it has played an important part in its past. International migration calls into play economic, legal, political, and cultural consideration. It is subjected to popular opinions, myths, and stereotypes. It invites debates that bring to the surface not always rational, but real, even if misguided, fears about the preservation and the nurturing of national identities. The work I've done internationally, particularly in the United Nations human rights system, has reinforced my conviction that the values expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights continue to hold the very best promise for a fair, secure, and prosperous world. These values have been embraced with different degrees of convictions by most Western countries, including Canada, particularly since the advent of the Charter. Not surprisingly, I believe that we must work vigilantly to protect and indeed to advance these modern ideals and ideas of equality, fairness, respect for individual rights and freedoms. But here as elsewhere, in my opinion, the greatest threat to Western values is not an influx in our country of people who may not share these values today. It's the hypocrisy of those claiming to protect these values and then repudiating them by their actions. This disconnect between rhetoric and action has gone a long way to fuel the pushback against the international human rights agenda. I think this surfaced very clearly in the debate surrounding the adoption of the Global Compact for Migration. Faced with a sudden influx of refugees, many actually were forced to flee regions that the West had contributed to destabilize, think of Iraq or Libya in particular. Europeans were for the first time asked to do something that was hard for them to do. And yet, it's not with a lot of hesitation that they had pressured others for years to do something that was equally hard for them to do, such as repudiating entrenched cultural practices at a pace dictated by others. This actually mirrored the very uncomfortable position that Canada found itself in when it voted against the adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007. Walking away from a text that had been decades in preparation, a process in which Canada had actively participated, was seen by many as another example of Western hypocrisy. I believe that this set back considerably Canada's effort to promote other important issues such as women and LGBT rights through Canada's development agenda. The disconnect between advocacy of affirmed values and the protection of perceived interests was blatant and embarrassing. Fortunately, in 2016, Canada reversed that position, and earlier this year, legislation was passed to implement the provisions of the Declaration. Yet, if there is one issue on which Canada shines internationally way beyond and above what most Canadians may realize, it's on the issue of international migration. Canada, even more so than the United States, which still remains a destination of choice for many, is viewed as the ultimate country of destination success story. Tout au moins jusqu'au jour où des images du chemin Roxham ont commencé à circuler dans les médias, le Canada était perçu comme une terre d'accueil bien gérée, accueillante et attirante, tant pour les réfugiés que pour les migrants soi-disant économiques. Je souligne le mot soi-disant parce que cette appellation, comme beaucoup de choix de vocabulaire, occulte la multiplicité des causes qui poussent les gens à quitter leur pays, souvent dans des circonstances où ils ont aussi peu de choix que les demandeurs d'asile, mais pour des raisons qui ne sont pas reflétées dans la Convention sur les réfugiés. Cette Convention, issue des horreurs de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, offre sa protection aux personnes qui fuient la persécution politique, la guerre, mais comme la plupart des instruments juridiques conçus par les Occidentaux vainqueurs de cette guerre, la Convention ne reflète pas les droits économiques et sociaux qui sont pourtant exprimés aussi clairement dans la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. Les migrants qui fuient non pas la guerre, mais qui fuient la misère, la faim, la corruption, l'absence de soins de santé, le manque d'avenir pour leurs enfants, et qui ne cherchent qu'à contribuer à construire une société juste et équitable, ces migrants, qu'on appelle alors des migrants économiques, sont souvent perçus comme des gens qui avaient le choix, et donc qui n'étaient pas persécutés dans leur pays et auxquels on ne doit rien. Pourtant, ce sont eux, tout comme les réfugiés au centre de la Convention, qui ont contribué à bâtir le Canada moderne. Our history of immigration is undeniably a success story, and there's nothing today to suggest that it shouldn't and wouldn't continue to be so. Those who, like many of us, have won the geographic lottery at birth have no reason to believe that this was the result of any particular merit or entitlement on their part, and it's therefore very difficult to understand why some are so adverse to sharing in what they refer to as their birthright. I'm aware that the fear of an influx of foreigners will transform our social fabric in undesirable ways. That fear is not new. It has emerged, mixed with different degrees of hostility in response to the arrival of most newcomers, despite the repeated success of their integration and contributions. The reality is that our social fabric is changing anyway. In this increasingly interconnected world, we have a choice. We could look to the past, romanticize it, and stagnate in isolation. Or we can embrace a future in which our children will develop their own culture, open to that of others, inspired by the choices we are making today. The only walls that will stop the human quest for a better future are the walls that we erect in our minds. And it's our own future that we imprison, I think, when we hide behind the barbed wires of exclusion. This brings me back to the title of my remarks today. Many of the Canadians who've been honored in this venue were the recipients of the Order of Canada. This is in part why I've chosen to entitle my remark, "A Desire, a Better Country," which of course is the motto of the Order of Canada, because I believe that this motto, "They desire a better country," is equally applicable to the hundreds of thousands of refugees and immigrants who have knocked on our doors over the years. They too desired a better country. Actually, most of them desired their country of origin to be a better one, in which they could continue to live and thrive and contribute. But when that became impossible, they chose us, as they desired a better country. And they continue to contribute immensely, individually and collectively, to make us so. What is maybe less well known is how much immigrants also continue to contribute to make their country of origin a better country long after they've left. However invested in their adoptive countries, diasporas play a critical role in the ongoing development of their country of origin. One only has to look at the massive impact of remittances to understand the significance of this contribution. Migrants regularly send money to their families left behind. The aggregate of these small sums, called remittances, that are sent home, particularly to poor countries, represent, in total, 3 times the total amount of official international development aid provided by rich countries to developing ones. According to the World Bank, in 2018, overall global remittances grew by 10% to $689 billion US dollars, including $528 billion to developing countries. Despite all the objective evidence pointing to the positive aspects of migration, the early response to newcomers, here as elsewhere, is often one of distrust and rejection. But it's over time, and increasingly through deliberate policies aimed at inclusion, that the full benefits of migration come to be realized, often to the benefit of the second generation of migrants through the sacrifices of their parents. The international effort to better regulate human mobility through the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration in 2018 was tested in the most unpredictable way by the onset of the COVID-19 global pandemic. The pandemic, which has dominated our lives now for more than a year and a half, has brought to the surface like never before the interconnectedness of the modern world. A public health emergency quickly engulfed the planet, testing even the capacity of sophisticated healthcare systems in the most developed countries, propelling science to the forefront of public debate, and overshadowing virtually all other issues everywhere. Even more so than international terrorism a few decades earlier, the pandemic was also about borders, isolation, and fear. It was also, once again, and dramatically so, about trusting our governments to find the right balance between our desire to be safe and our right to be free, or, put differently, between our right to be safe and our desire to be free. The big difference, however, I think, between the so-called war on terror and the fight against the pandemic is that this time we are all of us, all at once, possible victims and possible perpetrators. Wearing a mask, ostensibly to protect ourselves, is actually designed to protect others. Then, therefore, the us and them is a lot less clear this time than it was, for instance, at the outset of the war on terror, when it had been a lot easier to vilify a perceived common enemy. This time, the enemy was the virus itself, not the carriers, at least until some forces of disunity attempted to realign allegiances, nurturing distrust and yielding nothing to the common good. But so far, few have succeeded beyond their pre-existing echo chambers, and we have remained as a society, if not globally, profoundly engaged in a common project. The pandemic has therefore provided us with a necessary fresh look at the challenges that will come from climate change, at our dependence and reliance on science, at questions of personal choices and collective responsibility, It has fostered debates about utopic ideals of closed doors and self-sufficiencies. It has given rise to absurd conspiracy theories and has even branded as attractive autocratic leaders that some would like to trust, therefore saving themselves for having to make difficult personal moral choices. It has lifted the curtain on the people who work in essential services, and we discovered there not only migrant workers, but many undocumented migrants, very vulnerable people tasked with protecting all of us when we were ourselves at our most vulnerable. As we came to appreciate what services are truly essential to our collective well-being, who's providing these services, to whom, and under what circumstances, an unprecedented shift of attention has taken place, highlighting the needs of our aging population and the likely source of service providers who will take on that charge in the years ahead. So at the crossroads of the issues related to the pandemic and immigration, it could have been expected that the intuitive reaction of closing borders would have played against any opening of minds towards progressive immigration policies. But the pandemic made very readily apparent the difference between tourism and immigration, between essential and discretionary travel, and the continued imperative on relying on others, broadly defined, for our own survival. In fact, I believe that the pandemic has propelled us into a new era in which bold political choices will be more, not less, necessary and feasible. The sacrifices that we've had to make have opened our eyes to our ability to adapt, to live differently, to change. As I contemplate the possibilities for progress and the likelihood of fundamental change, I can only turn to the extraordinary advances in my own primary professional discipline, the law. There's no doubting the role that the law can play in either freezing old norms or, on the contrary, propelling reforms. In the civil law system under which I was trained, the status of married women remained until 1964 akin to that of minors and of persons stripped of their legal capacity. Women in my own province of Quebec did not obtain the right to vote until 1940, and not for lack of trying. At that time, I believed that the law was trailing way behind social mores, and that both legislators and judges, almost exclusively men, were at odds with the changing world, particularly as that change was accelerated after the Second World War. In contrast, when gender equality was entrenched in the Constitution in 1982, the legal, enforceable requirement of equality opened the door to a range of courtroom victories for women's rights, which transformed the reality of women's lives in significant ways and opened the path to reform for many other equality-seeking groups. The newly acquired audacity of judges relying on constitutional imperatives to bring the whole country to live up to its stated values and principles, that didn't go unchallenged. And yet the claims of judicial activism, of the legalization of politics, of governance by unelected tyrants, have not succeeded, I believe, in eroding the confidence of Canadians in their courts. This is particularly remarkable since this confidence doesn't seem to rest on the popularity of the outcome of any particular judicial decision. Indeed, in vindicating rights, the Supreme Court has often found itself appearing to side with unpopular minorities or having to put an end to an intractable public debate on heavily polarized issues. It's not by sheer luck that we've avoided the politicization apparent in the United States court system and the inevitable consequent loss of public confidence. And I think here it's really interesting to reflect on the impact of culture on process. When it comes, for instance, to judicial appointments, on paper, I think the UN system for the selection of Supreme Court justices, on paper, would appear vastly superior to the Canadian one. In the US, there's a public, transparent process engaging both the executive and the legislative branch with great media scrutiny on the merits of each proposed candidate. This would appear, it seems to me, vastly preferable to the slightly more opaque, seemingly unilateral executive process that was the Canadian system, at least until very recently, and frankly, which still commands very little public interest and debate. And yet, in my view, the reality is exactly the opposite. Political forces in the US have managed to transform that procedure into a visibly partisan process where merit is set aside in favor of political maneuvers blatantly interested in serving party political and ideological interest. In contrast, the vast discretion imparted to prime ministers in the Canadian system seems to have induced most of them to work prudently to preserve that privilege by exercising it in the public interest and avoiding the appearance of making nakedly partisan appointments. The tone, as much as the content of court decision, I think also goes a long way in reinforcing public confidence in the judicial system. Faced with the need to express their conclusions in a convincing manner and to address opposing views, judges, particularly those who operate in a collegial forum, like in appellate courts, have been well advised in this country to write in accessible language and speak in a respectful voice. Belligerent and dismissive rejoinders with colleagues only fuel an atmosphere of conflict that reflects and risks perpetuating the confrontational approach of the parties. We have therefore, I think, every reason to celebrate, and we must be vigilant to preserve the integrity of our judicial system. Allow me to refer to what I said to an audience of Pakistani lawyers and judges in Lahore several years ago. This was at the height of terrible tensions between lawyers and judges, between the bench and the bar. I said, the enforceability of court's decision rests, for the most part, on compliance, not on coercion. No judicial system could operate on coercion alone. When the judge walks into the courtroom, for example, if the audience refuses to rise, the judge, of course, could cite members of the audience for contempt of court and even sentence them to prison. But if the next day and the day after that, a new audience still refuses to rise as a show of respect for the court, will the judges eventually try to imprison the whole country to establish their authority and their power? The preservation of public trust is therefore essential to the proper administration of justice, and that in turn is essential to the proper functioning of democratic governance under the rule of law. This is a system in which citizens can turn with confidence to the court for the resolution of their disputes, including their disputes with the state itself. The day the audience doesn't stand up when the judge enters the courtroom, in fact or metaphorically, is the beginning of the end of judicial power. And in a properly functional judicial system, people rise to the court not because they're afraid, not even because they will necessarily agree with the decision in a case at bar, but because they respect the process and agree to yield to the authority of the court. I'm not sure that my admonition had much impact on my Pakistani fellow lawyers and judges, but I do remain persuaded of the value of living under the rule of law and of the important part that the judicial system plays in that. So let me conclude by saying a few words about the rule of law. It's a very rich legal concept, both powerful and dangerous at the same time. It's dangerous because if it's reduced to the idea of rule by law, laws that are oblivious to their content, it can be a very powerful tool in the hands of authoritarian regimes who like nothing better than law enforcement on their own terms. This was, in fact, the hallmark of Nazi Germany, a rules-based, oppressive, and murderous regime. In contrast, a proper understanding of the rule of law as a pillar of democratic constitutional governance requires that it be infused with content. Not only is it imperative that laws be properly and publicly enacted, that they apply to everyone, that they be understandable and capable of being complied with, but they must be demonstrably just laws. This was expressed, I think, with great clarity in the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which reads as follows: whereas it's essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. The rule of law, as endorsed in the Canadian Constitution, requires just that. It ensures to all people equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and it constrains the state not to infringe on the life, liberty, and security of individuals. Without such well-defined substantive content, the rule of law becomes an empty shell, dangerously useful to provide an appearance of legitimacy to the most oppressive state practices. In fact, I've never found a better expression of the rule of law than that was expressed by Henri Dominique Lacordaire, who was a leading Dominican priest in the 19th century, and he said, "Between the rich and the poor, between the master and the servant, between the strong and the weak, it is freedom that oppresses and the law that sets free." So as long as we continue to invest in this very simple but rich understanding of the rule of law, I have no doubt that those desiring a better country will continue to find it right here. Thank you very much for your kind attention and your generous hospitality.
Before you go, I would just like to thank you once again on behalf of the Confederation Center and, of course, everyone in attendance here for your very inspiring and thoughtful words tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.